What's up? We got Smallville, Season 1, Episode 2, Metamorphosis. And we're back with some more Smallville reaction review. Yeah, again, we're still looking at every single episode of Smallville again in a new perspective. And yeah, so yeah, in a new perspective. Last time we had the pilot, and it was a really good opener, even though it was kind of a bit outdated. Yeah, the show's kind of outdated. I kind of like the later seasons because the later seasons feel fresh, but the first season, the first I think like first two seasons feel outdated. But anyway, yeah. So let's start off with picking up right where the ending of the last episode left off. Where the last episode left off with Clark's barn zoom up as it goes to another place. As it zooms up from Clark's barn all the way to another house. That house of Greg Arkin. Another Lana creeper another Lana creeper who's really in love with Lana. He sends her butterflies and is watching her all creepily. And it's like, it's so odd. Like, Clark and now him. Like, bro, what is up with these guys and creeping on Lana? Like, you, dude, what is the matter with you? I know she's cute and pretty, and Kristen Krug is also kind of cool, kind of hot. But what is up with your obsession with Lana? She already has a boyfriend, Whitney, again, played by Eric Johnson. So, anyway, so after doing that, Greg comes home and discovers that his mom, Mrs. Arkin, has discovered what he did. And she's obviously mad, and she's obviously mad at him for basically stalking Lana, and tells him that how, basically, quote, how can she basically go, she's in the garden party with Lana's Aunt Nell, and how can she face Aunt Nell if she's knowing that her son is creepily watching her niece. So basically, Mrs. Arkin's like, oh yeah, dude, I'm totally gonna call military academy on you. And he's like, are you totally joking? And she's like, no, I'm not joking. You're weird. And he's like, what about my bugs? So Greg decided to take all of his bugs away, and of course they're green meteorock infested bugs. I guess we have to call them meteoroks now instead of kryptonite, which we'll do later. But they're meteorock infected bugs. And obviously, he's not watching where he's going. The bugs attack him, and then it cuts to a cockroach on his glasses. Then his mom discovers what he's doing and discovers that discovers his room fine. But then we see Greg kind of with Greg as he does this. So then we see the opening theme, Save Me by Raimi Zero. And this is such a great theme song. This is such a great theme song. Yeah, it's such a great theme song. And we have Eric Johnson in this opening. Yeah, the opening gets changed, changed. Every time there's a new character or anytime a character gets out of the show, the theme song keeps changing to reflect the new characters that come and go. So, this time we have Eric Johnson. So, we have all the main characters. So, yeah, it's a thing at the small. So, what happens is that literally Clark is throwing like a party or whatever. When throwing a party or whatever, that's when Lana and Whitney show up. And Clark and Lana asks Clark, where was he during the dance? But he kind of says he was tied up, and Whitney knows what he's talking about, but Lana doesn't. So Whitney asks for the kryptonite necklace back, but Clark's like, I don't have it. And he's like, it's really important to Lana. And he's like, then you should go out in that field and look for it. Oh, Clark with the roast. Yes. Yeah. Go, Clark. Clark roast. So then Lex shows up because he's, again, this starts the Luther. This episode starts the whole Lex thing of him showing up uninvited and being a creeper. So, oh yeah. So Lex is like, oh yeah, you totally like Lana. And he's like, well, she's with Whitney. And he's like, oh yeah. So, but meanwhile, what happens is that's when Greg shows up looking a bit different than his last appearance. And he kind of hits on Lana. But when he notices this, and it's like, he's like, stay away from my girlfriend, bug boy. And he's like, we're in competition, Whitney. He's like, there's no competition, Greg. And if you ever hit on my girlfriend again, if I find out that you're sending flowers to her room, I'll know about it. Okay, Whitney. Meanwhile. So, yeah. So, meanwhile, Whitney's just driving on his own when Greg decides to pounce and cause Whitney to get into a car accident. Martha and Bo Duke are totally just driving around. See, I told you, I can't help it. I can't help but calling them Bo Duke. Are just driving around. Are just driving around. But that's when Clark notices Whitney attack Whitney unconscious, and they do the worst fire effect ever, where Clark just jumps in. It looks like a real fire, but when you see Clark Whitney, it looks like a fake fire, only for the real fire to show up. So, yeah. So Lex decides to visit Lana, and it's revealed that Lex and Lana have a history, or Lana has a history with Lex. Where basically, when Lana was 10 years old, her aunt Nell took her to Metropolis for a horse riding competition, and basically, her father invited them in, but when she went up to went up to see the pool, she found Lex and one of his girls skinny dipping. Yeah, I don't know how. Of course, obviously, but anyway. So Lex decides to put some chaos in Lana's and Whitney's relationship by mentioning a certain necklace and a certain whereabouts about her boyfriend. Because, and she was like, oh yeah, you better ask Whitney where your necklace is, Lana. Because he's gonna know the answer. Yeah. So meanwhile, next scene is that Greg's mom, Mrs. Arkins, discovers Greg's room fully webbed, and when she discovers Greg reveals his plan. He says his plan. Yeah, he'll molt, he'll mate, he'll do something else. And then he mentions about a feral spider, and he says once it hatches, it kills its mother, and then he sprays all this web out of his mouth that I'm guessing entangles his mother, killing her. I guess we don't see it, but we do see her later in the episode dead. So I guess he killed his mother. I don't know how he did that, but I don't know. So, Yeah, so Lana decides to confront Whitney about it. Decides to confront Whitney about the dance. He says he lost the necklace. Lana's like, "Oh yeah, you think you were gonna tell me about that?" And he's like, "What about what about my necklace? Was that a joke too?" And so she walks off and runs into Greg. She decides to bluff Greg to talk to Clark. Greg is obviously not excited about this because it's Greg, and he decides to confront Lana. But Lana's like, "Hey, I'm not blowing you off. I have to talk to Clark." Meanwhile, Clark is at Lex's, and Lex is like, "Oh yeah, if you hadn't have saved Whitney, you'd be a killer, but you'd also have Lana yourself." So yeah, so he sees that Lex has the kryptonite necklace or the meteor rock necklace in his possession in a box. So Clark decides to take that box and discovers his sickness to the kryptonite necklace. Yeah. So they discover. So yeah. So yeah. So Clark goes talk to Chloe. Sorry. Goes talk to Chloe about where Greg is, but Chloe. Sorry, I have to say every time Chloe because now that we have the Alice Mac thing, it's just Chloe about everything that's going on. And Chloe mentions to Clark about it feels like she's outgrowing him, and Chloe's like, "I can never outgrow you vertically," and she's like, "So what about Greg?" And basically, so yeah, so they decide to go to Greg's house and discover his mom is dead. His mom is dead. So yeah. So that's when one night Greg decides to attack Clark next. And he jumps around the walls like Spider-Man, or like a black suit Spider-Man, and Clark notices Greg Arkin, and he's like, "It's Greg Arkin," and Martha's like, played by Nell Tool, she's like, "Oh yeah, Clark, didn't you and Greg and Pete used to hang out in grade school?" And he's like, "Yeah," and he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "He was a bug collector." And he's like, "What happened to him now?" He's like, I bump doing the halls sometimes, but people change." And he's like, "Well, Clark, people may change, but they don't turn into jumping Spider-Man." Yes, we'll get to the whole thing of Jonathan Kent being a naysayer later, because that's totally his character. Clark says something, Jonathan disproves it, until Clark later proves he's right, proving Jonathan wrong. That's literally the whole thing. But anyway, so so Greg decides to go into so Whitney and want to talk. Greg shows up, be like, "Yo, Whitney, your girl's mine," and knocks out Whitney using his strength. Then what happens is that Clark show that he takes Lana capture. He takes Lana captured. So Clark decides to go. Whitney decides to basically try to make up, make up Clark, but Clark speeds away before he can say he's sorry for that whole thing. Meanwhile, with the battle, we have battle between Clark and Greg. Clark goes up to Greg's treehouse, which is literally, of course, with kryptonite, which is kind of a good thing for like earlier when Clark said that when Pete mentions Clark could never go in the treehouse because he was afraid of heights, and Clark said he wasn't sure it was safely stable. That was because he was afraid of the kryptonite that was in the treehouse. So yeah, so Clark and Greg fight. Clark realizes that he's with lead. Then he's able to crush Greg, not killing him, but turning him into a million bugs. I don't know if we're going to see him again. Maybe he could show up like later down the line. Maybe the last season. I don't know. Because usually the last seasons are when they try to bring characters back into the show they haven't seen in a while. Just like in season 7 with a character that we'll get to in episode 18. Wait, yeah, episode 18. But, well, yeah. But anyway, yeah. So Clark saves Lana, but makes her believe it was Whitney. Then Clark returns Lana's necklace, but for some reason Lana thinks it's Whitney because I don't know how Clark just shows up at the door, but then she thinks it's Whitney, so Clark speeds off, and yeah, that's kind of episode 2. It's a fine episode. It's not one of the show's best, but yeah, it's not one of the show's best. Greg Arkin's a creepy character. I know why he's meant to be creepy, but hopefully he returns later down the line because I don't think that's the end of him. He just doesn't turn into bugs and then just never show up on the show. Maybe, like, as I said, in the final season we'll see him because usually that's when the characters come back in like last season to be like, oh hey, what was that character up to between season 1 and then? Who knows? But yeah, I liked the episode. It was fine. It wasn't all that bad. I can't wait. I can't wait to review more because, and I also like how they kind of hint at Lex because Lex kind of looks at Lana being like, I want to get with her in season 5. Just kidding. Actually, technically, he doesn't look at her like that, but he does look like, I have a crush on Lana too. Because who doesn't have a crush on Lana by this point? Clark, Greg, and Alex. Who doesn't have a crush on Lana by this point? Who does? Yeah, I liked it for the 4th time watching. It was alright. It wasn't the best. It wasn't the best episode. I'm glad it kind of acted like a second. It kind of acted like a part 2 of the pilot episode because it immediately picked up right where the pilot left off. So it was kind of like a second half of the pilot. I think it was meant to be the second half of the pilot, but they didn't want to make a 1-hour pilot episode. So they stretched it into 2 episodes. Because it kind of feels like a second episode to the pilot. Because it immediately starts off where the pilot ended with the zooming shot and the song going over to Greg's house. It kind of did act like a second episode act like a second half to the pilot. And it kind of referenced stuff that happened in the last episode. So maybe this episode was meant to be the original episode to the pilot because it does mention stuff that happens in the pilot episode. So maybe it was meant to be the original episode to the pilot. I don't know. I'm just saying that maybe. But yeah. But anyway, yeah. This was a good episode. I'm back in Reason React. And I cannot wait to see. And I'll see you next Smallville. Da 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 da. Also, yeah. I'll see you next time. I hope you have a wonderful night, and I'll see you tomorrow for next Smallville.